Welcome to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. I am your host, Emmy DeGrappa. Wyoming is called the Equality State because we were the first to give women the right to vote. 150 years later, we wonder what Wyoming women think about the progress toward equality now. Let's find out, and thank you for listening. Today, we are talking to Reverend Bernadine Craft. She is an Episcopal priest, a former state representative, a psychotherapist, and the executive director of Sweetwater BOCES. She is also born and raised in Rock Springs, Wyoming. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm good, Emmy. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, I'm thrilled.
I was reading in your bio that you were born in Rock Springs, but after you graduated from Rock Springs High School, you left Wyoming.
I did.
So my question is, what was your journey back to Wyoming?
You know, and that's such a good question, Emmy, because those of us who are natives, and I'm actually a second generation native. My mother was born in Rock Springs as well. We were all very similar. We were typical high school kids. You know, as soon as we graduated, we couldn't wait to get out. And I went to school out of state for my undergraduate and my master's level work. I went to the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Then I stayed there and worked as a school counselor for a couple of years. My district that I had graduated from in Rock Springs was actually building a new junior high and contacted me about coming up and interviewing for the counseling position here. And I remember driving up from Utah to interview for the counseling position and thinking to myself, this is going to be a really good job and I'm going to get it. And then I burst into tears and realized I'd be back in Rock Springs, Wyoming. That was kind of the mindset back then. And I did get it. And I stayed for a very long time working at that position. I left a second time to go back to pursue my PhD, which I got in Colorado at the University of Northern Colorado. And by then I had met my future husband, Larry, who was living in Denver. So I went to Colorado and did that degree and had every intention of staying there. Ran into some health issues and was able to come back. I had only taken a sabbatical from my school district position. And when the significant health issues developed, both Larry and I came back. So I not only returned, I brought him with me. And then that time my return was different. That time I realized Rock Springs is my home, Wyoming is my home, and this is not only where I think I'm meant to be, it's where I want to be. It's where I choose to be. And I always laugh. I like to quote this old, it's kind of an old cowboy poem. And I can't remember the poem, but one of the last lines of it is, when sagebrush gets in your blood, you can never, ever leave. And I think maybe that's true of me. My blood is full of sagebrush, and I can never leave my home.
And I do hear a lot of different stories about people returning to Wyoming that they just can't get it out of their blood.
Right. In fact, it was interesting. We had a class reunion this summer, and I was just really intrigued by how many of my high school classmates had a similar kind of journey, couldn't get out of here fast enough, and then realized, you know something, this is my home, and this is where I should be. This is where I really can have the quality of life that I want. This is the place I want to raise my family. This is the place that is my home, and it was fun to talk to people and listen to their journeys, which many of them were very similar to mine. Couldn't get out fast enough, and then were very, very thankful to be home.
And what do you find most intriguing about living in Wyoming?
You know, Wyoming, to me, and it took me a long time to realize this. I think it took me living in a couple of other places to realize the incredible beauty and strength of Wyoming. I say it all the time, and I still believe it's true, the finest human beings, the finest people I have ever met in my life have been in Wyoming. There's something about our proud Wyoming heritage where we're very independent. We're very, I don't want to say tough so much as probably resilient. I find people incredibly welcoming and incredibly anxious to create a place that's the kind of world we want to live in. I love the openness of Wyoming. I love going out on my back deck and looking up and seeing those stars that I think I could touch. I live in the Red Desert, which I hated growing up, and now I can't get enough of it. It's so beautiful and so serene, and it feeds my soul. I love cities. I love to go visit, and then I'm very anxious to come back to my wide open spaces in Wyoming to what I consider my big family of Wyoming residents.
Oh, that's great. That's true. There's such a small population that we can know everybody across the state in some way or another.
We really can. It's, Wyoming has been referred to as, just one small town with very long streets. And I think that can really be said to be true. We talk about 6 degrees of separation. And I think in Wyoming, it's maybe more like 2 degrees. And that's a fun thing. It's something that people don't understand. All of my years in state government, I just thought it was natural that citizens would contact their senator or their representative directly. I thought it was natural to not have a staff, to be easily accessible to your constituents. And boy, I discovered, visiting legislatures in other parts of the world and in other states, that's really rare, to have that level of contact and that level of familiarity with people in all walks of life. That's a rare thing, and it's something that I know I had always taken for granted living in Wyoming with its small population and with people who just know each other and are open and available and accessible to each other.
Wow, that's so true. And speaking of that, because you have served as a state senator and you have served in the Wyoming House, what was your experience there as a woman? Because right now we're celebrating Wyoming as the first state to give women the right to vote.
Right.
And as you know, we are called the Equality State.
Right.
So how did it feel being a woman?
And I'll maybe speak to my Senate experience simply because when I was in the Senate, I was the only woman. It was me and 29 guys. And I was always getting asked the question, how does it feel to be the only woman in the state Senate? And I would go, oh, that's right, I guess I am. I never felt that I had been treated the slightest bit differently. I never felt that I was patronized. I never felt that I was talked down to. I really considered myself on equal footing with the other senators, and I really felt like every single one of them treated me that way. The only thing that was kind of in my mind, and it was put there solely by me, I was the only one, I think, who felt that way, but I felt like it was kind of almost my responsibility to always be on my game. I felt like I always had to have my homework done. I felt like I always had to be at kind of the top of the game, which is maybe due to some part my highly competitive nature. But I think it also reflected on I did that to myself, but I thought, I'm the only woman here. And so I don't want to ever have a down day. I don't want to ever have been caught not being up to date or up to speed on a piece of legislation. I don't ever want to be able to argue anything less than eloquently for my own bills. I felt like I was really kind of representing my sex, if you will, and I really wanted to do the best job I possibly could. So there was that pressure, but it was pressure put on me. I mean, I did it to myself. No one there ever made me feel that way. I felt like I was respected because I did do my homework and I did contribute, and I'm proud of my record, not only in the Senate but in the House. And that was really the only thing that seemed to matter. And like I say, when people would say, "How does it feel to be the only woman?" I would be kind of like, oh, I guess I am. Now, that being said, I mean, the guys did crown me the Queen of the Senate and gave me my very own little tiara to wear. So we had fun with it. But as far as, yeah, it was great fun. But as far as the business of the body, I felt on equal ground with the gentlemen senators every single day.
And how do you feel that have things changed? Have things changed for women? Do you think women are making bigger strides in serving at that level?
There are more female senators than there were when I was there. So there's certainly, their numbers have increased. That is one of the things that I really kind of worked hard on because I was in the legislature for 10 years. And during my time there, that was something that really interested me. I'm very involved with Wyoming Women's Foundation, and when I was in Cheyenne, I was also involved with the Women's Legislative Caucus. And one of the things we noticed was women didn't run for office. That statistics showed that if a woman ran for a particular elected office, they were every bit as likely to be elected as a male. It was just that women didn't run. And there were a lot of different reasons for that. But one of them that we really tried to work on in both of those groups was mentorship of women. We discovered that, and this was true in my own personal case, women have to be asked. It seemed like in order for a woman to feel comfortable running for an elected office, especially a statewide elected office, they had to be asked and they had to be encouraged and they had to be mentored. Because I was recruited to run for the legislature, when I was approached about running, I was stunned. I mean, I was totally and completely shocked. I'd always been involved in politics. I'd been a lobbyist prior to that. So I was very aware of the process and very aware of issues. But running myself was the furthest thing from my mind. And people really took a long time and spent a great deal of effort encouraging me. And I always like to talk about Senator Raylyn Jobe, who I replaced her in the Senate. And after she had gone, and then there was another senator in between there, but it was the same Senate seat. But when I first ran, that was before you could file online, and you had to mail your candidacy in. I debated so long, and it took them so long to talk me into it, that Raylyn actually had to drive my application to Cheyenne so that it would get there under the deadline. And that seems to be not the exception, but more the rule, that we really have to work on identifying women, mentoring them, recruiting them, and then being there and supporting them. Because just left to my own devices, I would never, ever have sought political office.
And so why do you think that is? Why is it that men feel that that's their place and they just should do that, and women feel like, I don't know, I don't feel confident to do that?
Isn't that interesting? And that's something that we really wrestled with, is why is that? Why is it that a man says, boy, I want to do something about that. I think I'm going to file for county commissioner or the legislature or whatever. And a woman, and that's not to say women don't, because several of my colleagues did exactly that. One of my colleagues in the House knew from the time she was in grade school she wanted to seek elected office. So it's certainly not across the board, but my story seems to be more common, and we've wondered that, like, why is that? Because I'm certainly a very extroverted person. I'm a relatively confident person, so I wouldn't be the kind that wouldn't think I could do it. I think it was more like it was not on my radar. It was not something I had really even thought of as a possibility. And I always joke about that when people asked me if I would consider running for, at that time it was the House of Representatives, that it was almost as if they'd asked me if I'd ever considered running nude through the streets. I mean, that was about my level of comfort with it. I'm like, yeah, no, not doing that. And I really had to adjust my mindset. So I think a lot of times we overlook extremely good candidates candidates. And I know men in that same position too, where I have said, have you ever considered running for fill in the blank? And they're stunned too. So I don't think it's just women, but I think it is more likely to be women. And women bring a very different voice to the government, and it's an important voice to have heard. It's frequently a different perspective, and it's a different outlook, and that's what makes for good legislation, is where you have differing viewpoints working together, trying to come up with compromises and doing the best they know to do for the people of the state.
Well, I think that's great that you've been such an outspoken spokesman for women to run for office. That's really important.
I think so. Mm-hmm.
Are you a mom?
I have a stepdaughter who gets very angry when I call her my stepdaughter, because she says, I am not your stepdaughter, I am your daughter. So I do have a daughter who lives in Iowa. She lives right outside of Iowa City, Iowa. And she's, while she's not even remotely interested in politics, she's very much a leader in her profession and has really kind of followed not only my lead, but her father's lead in terms of being very involved and very committed to whatever she can do. And she's also a psychologist, so I guess that must run in the family too. But it's been fun watching her and people of her generation exploring, I can do anything I want to.
Right.
Kind of like we did. And I think I was extremely fortunate. Something that really gave me a leg up, I had parents who could not have been more supportive of do anything you want to do. You can do anything. They never, ever said, oh, you couldn't possibly do that, or, oh, women don't do that. They strongly encouraged education. They were a little upset when I worked for a few years before I went back and completed my PhD. They wanted me to go right straight through. So I was lucky. I was so lucky that I had parents who were there just supporting me and pushing me every step of the way. And I think that's not true for a lot of women.
Oh, well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that is an ingredient that you need to have, where your parents say you can do anything you want to do. Right, exactly. And that was so wonderful. It and where it really showed up was not so much in my political career, but the reason I chose to retire from the legislature was I was ordained an Episcopal priest. And that had always been a childhood dream of mine. I always wanted to be a priest. But when I was growing up, and even into when I was going through my first career choices as a school counselor and a teacher and a therapist, women couldn't be ordained in the Episcopal Church. It wasn't possible. There were no women priests or deacons. But it was still my dream. And I was encouraged to not give up on that. And when it did become possible for women to be ordained, I was so set on a different career path that I didn't take that other road. But it was while I was in the Senate, and the opportunity came for me to do some remote and online seminary classes, and then with just kind of minimal summer residency programs. So I was able to do it and was ordained in 2014 in my own home parish as their first female priest. And it was the reason I retired, because I didn't feel that I could give that particular calling the time it deserved and needed while I was still serving in the Senate. So it hurt to retire from the Senate. I loved every second I was down there, but I love being a parish priest. I love that. And that was something that when I was much younger and growing up and starting my career, that door was closed. And instead of saying, well, just say that door's closed, well, find ways to affect that change. Find ways to be involved in the policy and decision-making bodies, and find ways you can influence that. If you don't like it, what can you do to change it? Right. Well, you just inspired me that you actually had a childhood dream and you didn't give up on it. You kept going.
I never did. I never did. Yeah. And again, like I say, I was so lucky because my parents encouraged that. And granted, I was definitely older than I ever would have thought when I was actually ordained, but it did happen. And that's been fun to see. And that's where women have really gained ground, I think, is not so much in political arenas, but in other arenas, in private arenas. Right now, and I don't have the statistics, but I would venture to say that probably approaching half the priests in the Diocese of Wyoming are women. And that's a fun kind of thing to see more and more women entering a field that for so many years was closed to them.
Wow, that's exciting. And you forged the way.
Well, there were a lot of others ahead of me that were breaking trail, by golly. They really did. And I think that's another thing that's so important for us to remember, those women that came before us. And, it was interesting that you mentioned Wyoming being the equality state, and it is. But, we had the first female governor, and we haven't had a female governor since. And we've also, as I mentioned, not had that many female elected officers, officials rather, until I think we're making strides in that ground. Another area that I think we really need to be aware of is we have a really high gender wage gap. There's a big discrepancy between wages for men and wages for women in Wyoming, and that's something that we're needing to address right now, I think.
And how do we do that? How can we make those changes?
One way, because my experience, again, I never experienced that gap. I worked in education. I made as much money as the guy who was, whose office was next to mine. It isn't that where I think you really notice the gap is the number of high-paying positions that women do not go into. And an example I'll use, I live in Southwest Wyoming, so of course we have the trona industry here, and we have bridger coal, and we're very heavy on the oil and gas industry here. So the positions that tend to pay the most money tend to be pretty male-dominated, like to go underground in the mines, to work on some of those technical mining positions. They're well paid, and they should be. Those guys are in every dime they make. Whereas women tend to work more in the office, doing maybe more clerical kinds of things, which don't pay as well. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is, again, make sure we're conveying that message that women can do anything and that we're here to provide that help. One of the programs that I've been involved with peripherally that I love is a private program called Climb Wyoming, and I provided mental health services for Climb in the Rock Springs area for a number of years. And what they do is they train low-income single mothers in getting new workplace skills where they can earn a decent living for themselves and their children. And I remember the very first program I was involved in many years ago when Climb first came to Rock Springs was helping women get their CDL licenses. And so now all of a sudden women could drive those big trucks and make much better money than they could doing hourly work somewhere else. So I think we need to make as available as possible training and mentoring and opportunities for women to look at some of those positions that just simply pay more than the positions they often find themselves in.
Well, that's true. And I also think that maybe they just don't know it's available to them.
Absolutely right. Mm-hmm. They don't know. And so many times, again, just that particular population, that's where I think working with those women, I was always so impressed with them because they didn't have a lot of the advantages I had. They didn't have parents pushing them and saying, you can do anything. They pretty much had to do things on their own and had to find out about opportunities on their own. And so my way of thinking is whatever we can do to help in that arena, I'm hoping we can, and I'm hoping we will.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. It's been so great talking to you, Bernadine.
Oh, well, it's wonderful to talk to you, Emmy, and thank you so much for including me.
Absolutely. We'll talk soon.
Very good. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. Please join us again next week as we continue our conversations with women from around the state. You can also find us at thinkwy.org, where we continue the conversation on our blog about the history, journey, and the challenges of Wyoming's intrepid women living in the equality state. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening.